Frank's Red Hot is the perfect blend of flavor and heat, so you can use an entire bottle to make recipes like buffalo chicken dip or buffalo nachos, or even things that don't start with buffalo. Frank's Red Hot, I put that on everything.
Craig!
I'm so excited, and I just can't find it. I didn't even change the song that time. I just rolled with it, the original.
Yeah, we are excited.
Yeah. We have, this is Podcast versus Everyone. As usual, we forget to do that. I'm Craig Powers. With me is Jeff Newser.
But you're even more likely to forget to do it this week because we're so tickled.
Yeah, because we have guests, Jeff. We have
multiple guests this week, which is, we went forever without having any guests, and then we dipped our toes in with one guest, and now we have two guests.
And first I'll say our returning guest, he's kind of a co-host this week, is WSU assistant basketball coach John Andrzejek. Sorry, not as cool as an intro this time, John.
Thanks for having me. I pale in comparison to our main guest tonight.
Yeah, well, we all do. It's okay.
All right, and for our other guest, I wrote a little intro. His laptop single-handedly took Butler to consecutive Final Fours. He is Jim Boeheim's favorite writer. His blue is second only to Carolina in college basketball prominence. He made math cool again. He's contributed to The Athletic, College Basketball Prospectus, and lots of other places, but most importantly, his own website that you can totally pass off as work when your boss walks by. Ken Pomeroy.
Woo!
Hey, guys. Great intro. Love it.
We needed some, canned applause or something. Well, I don't know. I'm listening to Wait, Don't Tell Me every week still, but now they're doing it in, studios, and they have, the canned applause now so that at least it, sounds like people are laughing at the jokes and stuff. So, I don't know. Maybe we needed that. But that's what you get on this crap podcast.
Yeah, thanks for lowering yourself. What's that?
Provide your own applause.
Yeah.
I did. It just sounded like, anyway. But, yeah. So Ken, I guess we have to start with the question that everybody is asking everybody these days, which is, how are you spending your time cooped up in your home?
Yeah, I don't have I'm sure I'm not unusual in this, but I don't have a super exciting answer. A lot of it is spent in I've really become well acquainted with my home office, which surprisingly I usually don't spend a lot of time in. Usually if I want to get something done, I leave the house and, go someplace like a coffee shop or something and map out a certain amount of time and try to get a task done in that time. But I've spent a lot of time in my home office. Also doing a lot of bike riding. Really have gotten to learn the bike trail network of Salt Lake City pretty well here the past few weeks. A lot of house cleaning, a lot of stuff that isn't terribly exciting, but I know I'm not alone in that.
Yeah, it sounds like everyone's life. Your Salt Lake City must have some nice hills to hit. It
does. It's obviously you've been here, but I don't know how much you've surveyed the topography. But it is there's mountains to the east, and so if you want a good climb, that's where you go. And I've kind of steadily progressed from, in the old days, walking my bike up the hill to actually riding it without thinking too much of it. So there is that. I think I'm in a little bit better shape since this whole thing started.
Well, and that is something that you and Craig have in common. Craig is also a cyclist. And what was it? What was that one you did a couple weeks, a month ago?
The Chili Hilly.
That's right, the Chili Hilly.
It's a ride around an island, Bainbridge Island, across from Seattle. You take a ferry over, and it's about I think it was 1,800 foot climb in about 33 miles. So it was a good workout in February.
You also did Seattle to Portland, right?
I did, yeah. That was not very much fun.
It's a
literally Seattle to Portland?
Yeah, they have a ride that's Seattle to Portland. So you can do it all in one day, but we did 100 miles one day and 100 miles the next day. So,
well, you shouldn't be ashamed of that.
So
where do I
all right.
leave the pod? I don't belong.
Oh, don't worry.
My fitness has fallen off a cliff since this whole thing began.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I've drank a lot of beer. I know Craig has drank a lot of beer. Craig's trying to empty out his cellar. So
Yeah, it's bad news.
all right. Well, let's talk about things that maybe the listeners actually might want to listen to. Okay, so Ken Pomeroy, purveyor of kenpom.com for any listeners who maybe didn't make that connection. So Craig and I are one of the reasons why we're super excited to talk to you is just because, we always have, I know this is why John is here as well. Like we just have lots and lots and lots of questions on our mind, lots of things to pick your brain about. Like I know when I listen to your podcast with Griffin, like I love the way that your brain kind of, takes seemingly straightforward things and maybe turns it on its side a little bit to think about it. But, kind of before we get to all that, this is something that, Craig and I and John all sort of understand, but I imagine a lot of our listeners don't, because we get these questions and comments sometimes about the rankings and things like that. So maybe just and I'm sure you get asked this all the time, but maybe just give a quick and dirty explanation of how your ranking system works, and maybe also explain as a side note why if you beat a team that's like 50 spots ahead of you in the rankings, you don't automatically move up like 30 or 50 spots.
Right. As you're asking that question, I was thinking I need to start there really, because the nitty gritty of the rankings is difficult to explain, but the general philosophy is I'm trying to produce a list of ratings that reflect how good a team is right now, and theoretically how good they'll be like in the short term, like in the next 2 to 4 weeks, let's say. As it turns out, there's a large body of research that shows that the best way to make those predictions is really looking at scoring margin in general, and not necessarily wins and losses. So there are going to be times. So I guess the first thing is I'm not trying to rate like how good your season has been. This is not designed to select at-large teams. It's designed to just determine, hey, how good are you going to be going forward? And it's designed to make predictions, basically, I guess is a better way to put it. So if you're playing at home against a team 50 spots above you, depending on where you are in the rankings, you could very well be favored in that game. And if you win a close game against that team, if you're close to the prediction, your ranking is not going to change very much. So yeah, people get tripped up by that. I guess like the other thing to mention is that I think one of the reasons the ratings became popular early on was that I split the ratings into offensive and defensive ratings. So, you have an offensive efficiency and a defensive efficiency that's adjusted for the quality of opponent and how recently the game was played and some other factors. But it's not just meant to be a 1 to 353 rating. It's meant to kind of identify, offensive and defensive ability, and obviously the subscription portion of the website allows you to delve into more details after that.
Yeah, and on the subscription side, you have obviously a bunch more analytics, and you've in statistics. You've added more and more throughout the year. How do you decide? Obviously, you have the 4 factors, which is goes back to basketball on paper. But where do you? How do you decide what to include?
Well, at this point, certainly on that the main team page at this point, the standard is pretty high. There's not a lot of room for more stats on the team page. I guess last year I added non-steal turnover percentage because I removed the defensive fingerprint, which tried to estimate what type of defense a team played based on their stats. And as it turned out, it wasn't very good. So it was kind of a no-brainer to get rid of that, especially after Mike Hopkins took over at Washington. I mean, that was really the kicker where, they were playing zone, but they were sort of really extending their zone. And the stats that were being produced by their team were not consistent with most other zone teams. And so the rating or the algorithm kind of broke on that. And after fiddling with it a lot, I just kind of gave up on it and thought I'll just punch in non-steal turnover percentage to replace it. But for the most part, I feel like my philosophy on adding stats to the site. So, if I add stat to the site, or there is a stat on my site, it usually meets one of two criteria. The first one is that it obviously adds something to your analysis of a team or a player. Like it obviously has use. And on the flip side, I could also have a stat that is just like obviously trivial. Like there's no question that it doesn't add any like meaningful analysis if you're a coach or anything, but it is kind of an interesting piece of trivia. The stats I don't like to add are the ones that are kind of in between, and the ones that come to mind are like lineup type, plus minus or individual plus minus or things like that. Obviously, you can get those from other locations, and there are services that offer those. But even though it sounds cool and it sounds like something that's really useful, as it turns out, it tends to, especially the lineup based stuff. The sample sizes are so small that it just tends to not be useful. And if I ever added that to the site, I'm sure it would be misused in ways that would make me cringe. So those are the kind of things that I kind of avoid adding to the site.
John, go ahead and ask the next question.
Yeah. So, diving deeper into your site, you list coaching resumes for every coach, right? So at different schools that they've coached at, and how they play on offense, on defense, do they block a lot of shots, create turnovers, all these different areas. And one of the things that myself and the rest of the coaching staff, Coach Smith, really, really enjoy is kind of going through each coach and seeing their identity, the things that year in and year out, they're always good at, whether that's, taking care of the ball or creating turnovers or shooting a great percentage from two. And then there's some coaches that kind of go back and forth and play different ways, and you don't see that same hard trend. So long story short, if you take a look at my boss, Kyle Smith, on his page, what kind of jumps out to you?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that jumps out is defensively defending the 3-point shot, limited 3-point attempts, limited assists. Those two things usually go hand in hand. 3-pointers,
Definitely.
I guess, for people who don't know, 3-pointers are assisted on like 85 to 90% of the time in college basketball. So assist rate and 3-point attempt rate tend to be pretty highly correlated. You can find some exceptions, but for the most part, if you're limiting threes, you're also going to limit assists. And an extension of that, this is not always true as well, but teams that limit assists, like assist defense is like a thing that is not really ever talked about in any analysis or by any kind of commentator on TV, but assist defense is a real thing. And if you are good at preventing assists, your defense tends to be pretty good. Again, not always true, but there is a relationship there over time.
Do you make anything? I was going to say, you mentioned the 3-point, low 3-point attempts, low assist percentage, but also generally, at least the last 4 years, low 3-point percentage against. What do you make of that? And I know you've looked, taken pretty deep dives into 3-pointers. So is that something that sticks out to you as well as something that's been repeatable for him?
Yeah, I'm pretty skeptical about that. So I mean, my own personal belief, I've obviously read my stuff, and I don't have a lot of confidence in 3-point percentage defense in general being a real thing. There's some limited cases where I think it is. But to me, 3-point defense is mostly just kind of like a byproduct of your overall defense. So, if you, you look at like Tony Bennett team, like, they typically have very good 3-point defense, but they're, obviously you can understand that teams are probably just settling for some bad 3-pointers against them because it's hard to get anything else, inside the arc. So yeah, I'm on the skeptical side, especially given the fact that the 2-point defense wasn't very good this year. Like, those two things don't really match up. And so I guess I would be a little cautious about that continuing, but yeah, I guess that's kind of where I stand on that. I'm sure John can throw a million reasons why I'm wrong, but I'm going to stick to my guns here.
Well, that's maybe a good place to go with it. So, I mean, John, you're obviously familiar with what you guys are trying to do. So, from a statistical perspective, and like Ken said, I've read, all the stuff he's written on it. And it's this idea that, once the shot's up in the air, there's some randomness involved, right? But, do you feel like there's anything that you guys do that does suppress not just the attempts, but the makes?
Well, I'll start here. We are absolutely trying to limit 3-point attempts. So when Ken points that out, that's something we've been trying to do for years, really with only one exception. So we had 1 year at Columbia and this shows up very clearly on our Ken Pom page from that year. But we had 1 year at Columbia where we just did not think we could protect the rim at all because we were playing sort of really skinny and undersized. So we tried to be more in the gaps and kind of play the ball on drives and things like that. And we gave up way more threes because of it. Now, I will say this year, there were some internal conversations on the staff about like, should we move just slightly more that direction because we're giving up such a high percentage from two? So should we double the post more? Should we be in the gaps more on drives? Should we do some things that prevent uncontested or lightly contested layups, but potentially could turn into threes?
Makes sense. Yeah, the one interesting, I guess, point I'll bring up too is that obviously Coach Smith's successor at San Francisco, Todd Golden, he apparently has carried the same philosophy into the last season, and I've kind of talked to him about it, and it's obviously a conscious decision, but they were ninth best in 3-point attempt defense and 336 in 3-point percentage, which that's a harder one for me to explain. Like, you can obviously, you can noodle through the connection between suppressing attempts and teams maybe not making a high percentage, but how do you suppress attempts and have opponents, make a high percentage still of the few that they're taking?
No doubt.
So,
no doubt. I mean,
we'll see that kind of stuff, and it just makes you question, like, is 3-point percentage defense really a thing?
We tell our team in scouting reports, like, once the ball leaves the guy's hand, you don't control the outcome anymore. So the best way to take away a great 3-point shooter is never let him get it up.
Yeah, so I mean that's it's also interesting too. I tell people the thing that is most predictable in a basketball game is not the score. It's not the point spread or anything like that. It's where are the shots going to come from? Like, you show me two teams and what they defend. Just looking at 3-point attempt rate, just looking at that, like if I know the 3-point attempt rate for two teams offensively and defensively, like I can make a pretty good prediction about how many threes are going to be shot by each team. And if you even break that down further and tell me how many shots they get at the rim and things like that, I can noodle through like how many shots both teams are going to get at the rim in a game. And obviously the shooting percentage is the thing that makes the sport so interesting, and why you have upsets is because sometimes the shots go in, sometimes they don't. But the shot distribution is what both teams I think are really trying to control in the game.
Yeah, I want to kind of bring it back to when you talked about what you include on the page, and you mentioned plus minus in there as something that you statistically don't have enough sample size for, but I know coaches like it. They use it. John, I'm pretty sure you guys use plus minus in some way. So I guess, John, from your perspective, and I don't know if Ken, if you've heard from coaches like, hey, we do like plus minus. Why does plus minus persist still, even if there's this kind of statistical ambiguity there?
Well, we really try to take into account the sample size issues with plus minus, and we for the most part will not make lineup decisions based on the plus minus until we're about 10 games in. And then as we move forward and we look at like front court combinations, it's a similar deal where we're looking for 200 possessions, that sort of amount of data in order to make decisions on it. Now, the other thing that we do too is we actually have a company that uses Ken's rankings to adjust the plus minus stuff based on the quality of the opponent. So it first takes out all the quote unquote garbage time where it's, the team's up 20 with 2 minutes left. Those possessions we just omit completely. And then after that, it'll adjust for, okay, if you played even at Arizona, that'll be adjusted up to plus 0.15 or whatever it would translate to on an efficiency margin standpoint. Whereas if you play even at home against the last ranked team in Ken's rankings, that'll get adjusted down.
Yeah, there's there doesn't seem to be a lot of progress, I guess, in the last year or two, really, in terms of developing adjusted plus minus metrics. The kind of stuff that you see in the NBA that is pretty useful. There's a number of different flavors out there, but you're starting to see that at the college level. I've dabbled in that myself. It's a huge challenge. It's a bigger challenge in college than it is in the NBA. There's more teams, more players, fewer games, more garbage time, more players who don't see the bench very often. There's a lot of that stuff going on. So, but we're getting closer to having better measures like that. So, I guess I don't want to downplay the concept of plus minus, but just using it from a raw sense without accounting for who's playing or who your teammates are or the context of the game, whether you're up 20 or the game's tied or something like that. There's some pitfalls definitely involved there.
Yeah, I've always heard it described as a stat that's very noisy because it's just got, so many factors, right, pouring into it, trying to, like as a football fan, right, trying to account for, okay, what's the running back, what's the offensive line, right? And so, you're kind of trying to figure out all of that with plus minus. And, John, I'm kind of curious with you. So I think you kind of referenced this, but I kind of want to make sure I was hearing it right. So when you're looking at combinations, front court, back court, that kind of stuff, I presume you're also looking at more than just points plus minus, but looking at things like rebounds or maybe turnovers or assists or whatever.
Yeah, so we have a whole program that's been built out over a few years that actually gives us all the four factors when that guy is on the court or when that pair is on the court. And we will, Ken may not like this, but we will look at it and go, all right, why are we not defensive rebounding well with this group? And is it a issue of do it better, where we can do a better job blocking out? Is it an issue of this personnel just can't do that? And this is kind of how it's going to be. And if we want to make that area defensive rebounding or whatever it may be better, we have to make a substitution. Or is this a style of play thing where maybe it's a ball screen coverage where we're playing undersized, we're giving up too many twos? Do we need to play more up the line, blitz some stuff, try to keep the ball away from the rim? So we'll use it as like quick little looks into kind of the tenor of the game when those guys are in, and then and at all times trying to keep into account the sample size issues and not really drawing any big conclusions from small data.
So, John, I'll ask you this: do you think, looking at let's just talk about like defensive rebounding, is there a serious like interaction effect between teammates? Like, do you gain? I guess my thought on this has always been I can probably do just as well figuring out how a lineup is going to rebound just looking at their individual rebound percentages.
So I would actually push back on that.
Okay.
I would push back on that, and this is maybe something unique about our system, but we really try to block out, and it's a big part of how we coach, and it goes back to St. Mary's when Coach Smith and Coach Bennett kind of first developed the hustle stats, and so we use a lot our 4s and 5s especially to try to just take their guy out of the play. Now this year was maybe not the best indicator of that. Our Columbia teams were a bigger indicator of that, but we would use our 4s and 5s to kind of take their 4s and 5s out of the play because those are the guys that usually get the most offensive rebounds for every team. And then we would use our guards to kind of come in and gang rebound and clean it up. Now, practically speaking, your bigs are still going to get more rebounds than your guards, even doing it that way. But we've found that has helped our defensive rebounding. So for this year, like Jeff Pollard is a graduating senior, good player for us. It started a lot of games, and his defensive rebounding numbers are not very high, especially for the position and this level. But Jeff's one of the best we've ever coached on blocking out. And so, according to the plus minus stuff over the course of the year, we were a little bit better defensive rebounding team when he was in the game than even when we subbed in some guys that corralled more rebounds themselves.
Gotcha. So that explains CJ Ellaby's elevated defensive rebounding percentage.
Yeah, like whenever he was at the three, he would just kind of pin his ears back and go try to grab the ball for the most part.
Yeah, I got to think you guys, John, when you came in and saw CJ, he was already a pretty good defensive rebounder under Ernie Kent, but you got a guy a 6'6" guy that has a 3 skill set that you know you can crush, has a pretty good instinct for rebounding. That can just crash the boards. That must have been pretty nice for you guys when you came in.
No, it was great. He helped us a lot there. And then the one thing that was tricky for him and kind of new for him to get used to is when he did play the 4, we had to try to get him to block out more. And it was a good problem to have because he's so gifted at going and getting the ball in traffic. But for some of these guys, some of the athletes you go against at the 4 when we're playing a little undersized, we want him just to keep his guy from getting the ball.
Right, yeah, and that was the nature of your lineup this year. yeah, they put CJ at the 4, especially with the injuries.
Yeah, back to that again. Since now we're talking about WSU players, I want to ask you about offensive efficiency. And so WSU had a player this year who was a bit of he was a high volume shooter named Isaac Bonton, and he was sort of a source of consternation for a lot of fans because he did shoot so much and his efficiency was in general not real great. However, it was really interesting. He was injured for a couple games and the offense was very, very difficult without him. And one thing that I always find interesting is trying to do the calculus in my head of how you balance a player's efficiency with their usage, and try to kind of come to some equilibrium of, okay, this guy maybe is using a lot of possessions out of necessity. Therefore his, true efficiency talent level is probably higher than what is showing, and then kind of vice versa. And back to Jeff Pollard for a sec. So, Jeff Pollard, 15% usage, had an offensive rating though of 118, but obviously you may not want to, double that guy's shots just because his efficiency is really good. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, when you look at a team page and you see all these players and their efficiencies and their usage, how do you kind of try to make sense out of balancing usage and efficiency?
It's pretty tricky. There's no question. I think players have sort of like basketball personalities, and obviously, Jeff Pollard's personality is not to be the offensive go-to guy. And, likewise, Isaac Bonton he's going to get up shots. Like, you may be able to coach him a little bit and get him to be a little more selective, but for the most part, that's just his nature, and some of that you have to live with. I think, obviously playing Washington State, like, I guess I wouldn't mind Isaac Bonton taking shots. Like, you look at his 2-point percentage at 36%, and there's probably a lot of difficult twos that he's taking, and so
absolutely,
to that extent, you're going to be okay with that. But it is tricky. Obviously, if you could pull back some of those bad shots and just reduce that usage to the mid-20s and see that offensive rating go up. I think distributing those shots to other people would serve the offense better. But distributing all of those shots to Jeff Pollard probably wouldn't serve the offense better. So it is, it is kind of a challenge.
Oh, that'd be so many jump hooks though. But is there like a quick and dirty formula that you use? Like, okay, reducing, usage by this many percentage generally results in this kind of an uptick in offensive rating?
Yes. I believe so. I haven't necessarily done this work at the college level. It's really tricky actually to kind of figure that out.
Because it seems like there would be a curve to it.
Yes, right. And there's the work I've seen at the NBA level, I believe it's a trade-off of like 2.5 in offensive rating for every 1%. So you take 1% off of a guy's usage and his offensive rating should go up by 2.5. But it is tricky. People, Dean Oliver pioneered the skill curve concept where basically, you can just chart a guy's offensive rating by his usage and kind of look at it on the game level. But it is very tricky because, if you just do the raw value pretty much, you're almost going to get a straight line. Like when players are not feeling it or they're playing, they're in a situation where the defense is keying on them or there's just a bad matchup or whatever, they're just naturally going to decrease their usage and you're probably not going to see their offensive rating increase in those situations. So it's a very tricky thing to kind of detect. But, it seems like a pretty reasonable estimate that, 2.5 points in offensive rating per 1% usage is probably about right.
So if we get Bonton down to 25, then he's about 100 O rating, over 100 O rating player. So that sounds pretty good. That does seem much closer to his skill set. He did have to take. I mean, if you watch the Cougs, like Bonton took, a lot of difficult 2-pointers. And it really was out of necessity quite often. It's funny, like balancing it, us as these stat nerds, but actually watching Bonton play about 10 games into the season, you kind of figured out what the coaching staff was looking for him. And obviously, John, you're here, you can speak to that, but what looking for from him and how important he was. And then it was this kind of unique situation where towards the end of the season, he was out for 2 games and all the fans absolutely immediately saw what this guy meant to the team. And it's funny, even in our little group of writers on our website, that maybe were a little Bonton haters before suddenly came around to him. And it's kind of this hard thing to explain to people who just kind of take passing glances at your numbers and stuff, is that there's a lot more context to them, than it looks like. It's not just this this player is better than this player because they have a higher offensive rating, and I think you've done some good job explaining some of the stuff in your writing, but what has been some of the harder things for you to explain to people? I know obviously these slow tempo teams, defensive minded teams like Wisconsin and the Bennetts and stuff, or Tony Bennett, seem to have people seem to look at those and you've found the Wisconsin problem over and over again. So what's something like that you kind of come back to and makes you reevaluate?
I guess let's clarify here what we want to talk about. Are you talking about things that are just misperceptions?
Yeah, misperceptions for sure.
Yeah. Well, I guess the one thing that always kind of still disappoints me, I feel like there's an overuse of field goal percentage. I get that it's kind of a legacy statistic that we've had, almost since the beginning of basketball stats, but we're just talking about Isaac Bonton and his 2-point percentage. I mean, to me, you'll see a guy who takes a lot of threes and then they'll talk about his field goal percentage isn't very good or something. Well, the reason his field goal percentage isn't very good is because he takes a lot of threes. And obviously when he's making those shots, they're worth more than most shots that other people are taking. And so to me, it's a very simple, just a very simple thing that any audience could understand. if you just split things up into 2-point percentage and 3-point percentage and understand the differences there, and then an extension of that is that obviously there's a lot of like variance and luck in 3-point percentage. There's no doubt there's obviously skill there as well, but on a game level, on a 10-game stretch level, a lot of variation in 3-point percentage. Whereas you can't fake 2-point percentage. You can't fake being good, you can't fake being good at it, first of all, offensively or defensively. If you're bad at 2-point percentage defense, that's going to show up very quickly. It's going to stabilize very quickly. And to me, it's just like a really like easy point of analysis, like especially early in the season, to just kind of drill down on that. And yet people kind of overlook that, and just still there's a lot of old school work where people just refer to field goal percentage. And in 2020, it's kind of frustrating that we're still at that point, because I don't think it's like a hard transition to make. Like anyone can understand what 2-point percentage is. They know what field goal percentage is, so you don't even have to explain it to them. But we still struggle with that.
Well, Ken, you'd be happy to know then that on every scouting report we do not include field goal percentage, and we instead put 2-point percentage, 3-point percentage, and then what percentage of that player's shots are threes.
I love it. Yeah, those are the things I think every analyst should be looking at for a team, and obviously for a player as well. But that's really the first thing I look at for a team if I'm going to watch a game or just want to do some research on a team. Twos, threes, and then the percentage of shots from three. Like those are the holy trinity of field goal percentage, basically.
The guys we struggle with on how to guard in those scouts are guys that, for instance, take 70% of their shots as threes, but don't shoot a good percentage on those. It's like what do you do? Like if a guy takes 80% of his shots as threes and shoots a great percentage, it's pretty simple scout. Don't let him shoot any threes, But if a guy's taking a lot of them and using them at a rate that, on paper at least, in that run through the year or 2 years of data or whatever it is not helping their team, so he's shooting 25% on threes. What do? Do you just leave that guy open? And we've tried that in some games. Do you say, all right, well, he's shooting 25% on shots that are, presumably the defense is trying to guard, but if we give him uncontested shots, maybe that goes to 35% or 33% where it's not as good.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that their numbers are a reflection of the past, and they're not necessarily a reflection of their true skill. And trying to figure that out is a challenge. Like you say, if it's a guy's a 25% shooter and you leave him open, he's going to shoot better than 25%. So what can you live with? Historically, generally there's a rule of thumb. If you want to predict a guy's 3-point percentage going forward, his 3-point attempt rate is very useful in doing that. Maybe not, depending on where you are in the season. Later in the season, his 3-point percentage is a better predictor than his 3-point rate. But if you really, early in the year and the guy's taken 33s in the first 3 games and he's made 25% of them, chances are very strong that he's better than a 25% shooter. Like he doesn't have that kind of green light because he sucks at 3-point shooting. So that's the stuff, I guess that I've become obsessed with more recently, is just the numbers are the numbers, but what is the guy's true skill in these categories? And that's a little bit harder to figure out.
Yeah, we saw that with Ellaby this year. His 3-point percentage dipped, and I know a lot of players' 3-point percentage dipped, obviously, because the line moved back, but his dipped quite a bit. But last year he had, a guy who's in the developmental league right now as a scorer alongside him, and kind of taking that attention away from the defense. He was shooting a lot more spot up threes, and this year he's shooting a lot more off the dribble, one-on-one type threes, and you wouldn't suddenly say that Ellaby is a worse 3-point shooter. He actually shot 90 more threes this year than he did last year. But you'd still not a guy you would want to leave open, and I'm sure John would be very happy if the other team left him open for 3.
Yeah, no doubt. Those are the guys that are really tricky to scout, are the guys that use a ton of possessions because you might play a guy like the guys that use a ton of possessions. Sometimes their efficiency their O rating is just lower, just in virtue of how large of a load they have to carry. And I think you get in a lot of trouble when you try to guard that guy less or de-emphasize him on a scouting report just because his O rating is 85 or 92 or something like that.
John, do you ever hope that the coach on the other team, the coaching staff, isn't quite maybe they've just discovered Ken Pom and they're maybe using it in that way? They're like, oh, well, this guy's got an 85 O rating. He's taking 30% of the shots, but he's only got an 85 O rating, so we'll just leave him open. So, do you ever hope, or do you ever come across that in your opposing coaching staffs?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, for sure. I mean, we talked about Isaac earlier. You would not want to leave that guy open. That would not be a good strategy. Because if he gets an open three, he's going to bang it. He's a good shooter. For us, he has to take some pretty hard shots. And on the flip side of it, when we're scouting a guy that uses possessions at that rate, a lot of times we'll emphasize to the team, like, the reason his shooting percentages are low is because you can coax him into taking these type of shots. And so we'll show a couple clips of a guy taking a tough, step back, mid-range, pull up two, or something like that. And we'll say, hey, we're good with these shots. Two's over a hand. We want him taking these. But the plays where he's ripping downhill, getting to the rim and drawing a foul, or he's stepping into a catch and shoot three, even for the guy at that 90 O rating or 92 or 87, those are probably still going to be good shots for him. His O rating is low because he's taking a lot more harder shots.
Harder shots are always better than a turnover.
Yeah, sure.
That is true.
And that's actually an interesting point.
That was our offensive philosophy this year.
Yeah, I was going to say, that was definitely low turnovers. And it seemed to be, at times, your defensive philosophy this year, too, is to force more turnovers when that opportunity presented itself, rather than trying to defend maybe a team that's 5 inches taller than you on the interior.
For sure, absolutely.
Just a quick follow-up on that with Ken. It seems anecdotally that more teams are going to turnover pressure on defense and also reduction of turnover on offense just as a philosophy. Is that, you look obviously at the big picture a lot more than I do. Is that something that seems true to you, or is that just something that's in my head?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you would detect that. Obviously, those are two opposing forces.
Right.
So, I mean, to me, the trend over time has seemed to be players are less mistake prone. And there's a variety of reasons why that could be. But, players just commit kind of fewer ball handling turnovers and things like that over time. Certainly fewer than they did like 20 years ago. Now, maybe things have leveled off since then. So I don't know if I have a really unique insight into that, other than it does seem like turnovers are vanishing a little bit. Although they did go up a little bit last year, if I recall. I'm just going to pull that up. Yeah, turnover percentage went up slightly last year for the first time in a while. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, we're at historic lows basically when it comes to turnovers.
Are you trying to tell us that players are actually still learning the fundamentals and they haven't forgotten how to shoot and pass the ball and dribble?
And that they might actually be more fundamental now?
Yes. I guess that's one of those pet peeves of mine, right? That old timers criticizing players for lack of fundamentals, because whatever stat you want to look at, it seems like this year wasn't maybe the best for shooting, but there were reasons for that. But obviously until this year, we've seen this consistent climb in shooting percentages and free throw percentages and a drop in turnover percentage, and just all the statistical things you would think about with regard to fundamentals seem to be getting better, which makes sense. Players are playing more than ever. The grassroots circuit has matured to a point where the great players are playing against other great players in really like kind of game controlled environments in a way they weren't necessarily 20 years ago. So it would make sense that players are are more skilled than they ever have been. So yeah, I'll fight that fight whenever you guys want.
Yeah. Well, and listen, people will also say things like they don't watch the NBA because it's not fundamental. And
Right,
my head wants to explode because
Yeah.
I'm like, you might actually be telling on yourself about something else, but I'll go ahead and leave that one there.
Yeah, if you look at turnover rates in the NBA compared to college, it's pretty wild.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So one thing I know that you are an expert at and in the business of is, as you mentioned, predicting, and a sort of a byproduct of that is projecting. And so, as you're projecting from one season to the next, and that's another thing that people sometimes get wrapped up in is, the early season movement and the rankings that incorporate the projections. But I imagine you've been doing the, season projection thing now for, I think, about 10 years. How do you go about kind of trying to figure out how much each player is anticipated to improve? So, is it as simple as, a percentage improvement from a, freshman to sophomore, junior to senior? Is it something more like trying to figure out, usages and how much that determines how much a guy will improve? What kind of goes into that? And then as a kind of a secondary question to that, between which years, so anecdotally, most people I think say that the biggest improvement comes between freshman and sophomore year. Do you find that to be true, or does the data bear something different out?
So the second part is yes, that is true. Like, younger players tend to improve more from year to year. As far as like the projections go, it's a little hard to explain. So it is mostly, I don't know, it's, let's say, half like team based and half player based. Like, there's player information in there. It's looking at, how good a team has been the past few years, and then it's looking at who's coming back from the roster and what other players are coming in that either have previous Division I experience or are a top 100 recruit. So that's the player level information that goes in there, but it's not necessarily projecting stats for a player for next year. It's basically looking at their role, and it's looking at their class, and it's looking at kind of various stats. So, points, rebounds, assists, what they contributed to the team last year, and using that to project a team's offensive and defensive rating going forward. So I can't tell you where, like, a specific player, I can't tell you what they're going to do next year. That's not what the system does exactly, but it does basically, use that information. Players' usage was blah. It's not necessarily usage per se, but it's like field goal attempts. How many field goal attempts did the guy take as a share of the entire team?
That makes sense.
And if that guy's coming back, then the team will improve more. If that guy's leaving, the team takes a pretty good hit. So, like, Kyra Lewis just basically, committed to the draft, and I think I had Alabama like 14th in the country before then, and they dropped to like 34th or something because of his absence. So obviously, if some bench warmer left Alabama, they wouldn't have dropped hardly at all. But because it's basically their most important player, they get hit pretty hard.
And
so we want CJ Elby to come back. Is that what I'm gathering?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, Jeff hit the nail on the head. Like, I have been doing this the past 10 years, and if he were to come back, if there were no real other personnel changes, like, this would be the highest preseason rating for the Cougars since the first year I did this, which was Klay Thompson's last year. So that gives you something to think about.
You're putting pressure on us. Don't do
that. Don't let him leave, John. Don't let him leave.
We need to get that little audio clip and send it to CJ and just be like, hey, man, we got a chance.
So, Ken, when you're doing these projections, one thing I think about when WSU brought in a couple grad transfers last year, they could be seeking another one this year, and a lot of times with WSU, the grad transfers come from a mid-major or low-major program, and then they transfer over. How do you factor in a player who's coming from basically a lower competition conference and coming up to a major conference?
So that's a great question, and I should point out here too, like I'm for about 99% of the algorithm, like I'm not going in and saying, okay, if this happens,
Right.
this team gets 2 points and that, it's all based on history and it's just a giant regression, and that's how it works. So when it comes to the transfers, there is a team effect. Basically, it looks at, hey, how good was the team that he came from, and how good is the team that he's going to, and how good were they last year? So it's not a perfect model. You'd want to know how good they were, I guess, expected to be this year, but it's just easier to look at last year's ratings. And so if you're an up transfer, obviously your effect is going to be diminished somewhat. Your offensive rate, basically the way it works is like, your offensive rating will actually go up as you go to a better team, but your usage will go down, which I think makes it too sense.
Your buddy Jeff Goodman, I saw him do he did an analysis, but without any sort of hard stats really on that, and I've wanted to kind of dive in and look at that myself, just using advanced stats. But yeah, that's pretty interesting. What about John, from your perspective, when you guys are evaluating transfers from mid-major schools, how do you do that calculus?
Well, first off, it's very difficult because you're trying to look at what ecosystem the player was in before, in terms of how good was his team, how good were his teammates, and you're trying to project him up. And I think it's really an inexact science. And there's been a lot of guys that we've been surprised by in both directions, where they were guys that scored 18 a game at a lower mid-major school, and then they went to a BCS program, and now they're scoring 3 points a game. Now, on the other hand, there have been some guys that we kind of did not think would translate over as well, and they've done well. So it's a mixed bag. It's an inexact science, and that's where we try to dive into the film more to help us.
Well, I would point out someone who I wouldn't make you say anything, but obviously from Jeff and I as a fan's perspective, like Tony Miller coming from Division II school into the Pac-12, we didn't have high expectations, and then suddenly he turns into this very effective offensive player, and a very athletic defensive player that you guys are putting at the 4, a 6'5" guy from that had previously played at Seattle Pacific. So I can see where sometimes you get surprised, and then sometimes it just doesn't work out. But that's obviously an interesting thing. And then you guys took a lot of you took some JC transfers. I thought it was very interesting. Just one final thing on the projections is that WSU came, I think it was about in the 160s to start this year, after several seasons of hovering 180 to 200 or so. Do you factor the coach's history? Is in the algorithm? Is there coach's history in that projection, Ken?
Yeah, it's very simple. Maybe I'll make it work. Maybe I can work something more complicated into it this year. Although there's so few coaching changes this season that won't make much difference. But basically, you get dinged for a coaching change pretty much, unless you're just one of the worst teams in Division I. You won't get dinged as much. You may even get a little bit of a bump, but for the most part, you get dinged if you change coaches. But the exception is if you have a coach who has previous Division I experience, you don't get dinged as much. So that's the entirety of the logic that goes into that.
That was interesting. So I had thought that maybe because Kyle Smith had a nice track record that you got a little boost, but apparently it was maybe just some of the returning minutes like CJLB and stuff that gave the boost. But so John, I know you had some questions. I'd love to give you some time to ask Ken a question here.
Yeah, so one of the things we've thought about for a long time with your site is you do a great job adjusting the offensive efficiency and the defensive efficiency for the quality of the opponent, right? So, your site is able to take into account that scoring a 1.00 points per possession at Virginia, who finished first defensively in your ratings last year is much more impressive and harder to do, and a better predictor of future offensive performance than scoring 1.20 points per possession against the team that's the last rated defensive team in your system. So my question is, have you looked into it all, adjusting the 4 factors for strength of schedule in a similar way? So figuring out that one team has a very good defensive rebounding percentage, but maybe a big part of that is they've faced a ton of teams that are very poor offensive rebounding teams. Or do you feel that just in the long run it kind of washes and everybody's around average?
So I struggle with this. I'm not opposed to adjusting the 4 factors. The points you make are great, and there's always teams that come up, like you point out, a team that looks really good at defensive rebounding. They play in a worse conference, and furthermore, that conference, like all the other teams, don't try to get offensive rebounds. So, of course, that team's defensive rebounding percentage looks great. I don't think it all washes out, and I think there is a lot of context that is involved there. But I guess where I struggle is, first of all, I like the fact that the stats are raw and people can just check them and they can do the calculations on their own and make sure that I'm correct. And so it is kind of transparent that way. The other point is where would I put that information, and then how would it be used? I guess that's the issue. It kind of, so with offensive and defensive efficiency, sometimes you'll hear people say, well, Washington State only allows, 98 points per 100 possessions, and they're looking at my adjusted defense, and really that's
right.
not a true statement. It's obviously adjusted. And I guess so I worry that adjusting the 4 factors would be used in that way as well. So I'm open, I'm totally open to suggestions, and if you would find it useful, that actually means a lot. A lot of the stuff I've added to my site actually has been from the suggestion of coaches who say, hey, this actually would really help me out if you did this. So I'm certainly open to it. It's more, I think the limitation right now is more, I guess, it's kind of site architecture almost, where would that information go?
We for sure would use it. If there was a way to click a button that kind of made those 4 factors adjusted or unadjusted, we would use that. And then the other one, if I can make a shameless request, is if you would put the 3-point or percentage of shots that are threes for each individual player, because that's the one thing left that I calculate by hand for every scouting report, every guy that we play against.
I will take that into consideration. What's funny is that I'll just share this with you guys, but I do have kind of a secret page that has all the players broken down by those kind of metrics. So it has their assist their assist percentage on those shots, how often those shots are assisted, has their attempt percentage, and I've just never been able to pull the trigger on making that page public, but maybe I can do that this off season. Obviously, I'll have a lot of time on my hands, but yeah, I hear you. I mean, so I look at this secret page quite a bit. What is the percentage of shots, not just from threes, but at the rim, obviously just from play-by-play data. So it's not perfect, but I do have that information. It would it wouldn't take me long to put it on the site. It's just maintaining it and making it look nice would be the challenge.
Well, I think the solution here is obvious. You just make that a premium feature for another $10 a year.
Yeah, you get a Patreon, Ken. You need a Patreon. That'll be your Patreon level stuff.
I gotta ask the price question. I gotta ask this. Obviously a lot of your site is invaluable. I mean, it's every year we say it's the best $20 we spend. And you've kept it at that price for a while now. Is that a revenue maximization strategy? Is that feeling that you want to just have the information out there as much as possible in order to make the wider basketball community as educated as possible? What's the reason why you aren't charging us $1 million a year?
All right. Well, I get this question a lot, and it does maybe at first glance seems silly, but there there are many reasons here, and I'll lay them out. First is that obviously I could charge the Washington State basketball program more money for this. They would pay more than $20 a year. I get that, but most of my subscriber base is not made up of college basketball coaches. You know, it's mostly fans and other assorted people that pay for this. So that's one reason I can't charge like $100 a year. The second point is that as time has gone on, you know, there's been a little more competition. There are, you know, other free alternatives to getting advanced stats, and I think like Hoop Math. I think Hoop Math is the only other site maybe that charges.
Yeah.
So there's that as well. So the more you raise the price, the more you maybe drive people to check out possible other locations for various pieces of information. And the third, so that's basically the crux of it. Like I think on the short term, am I maximizing revenue? No. Like I could raise the price point and I'd lose a few subscribers, but I'd make more money in general for the upcoming season. But kind of having a longer horizon, looking, you know, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, keeping the price point pretty low is very useful just to kind of maintain a larger subscriber base, which in turn, like I think increases word of mouth. It maybe makes it easier for the media to cite my information. There's a lot of factors that go into play, and that's not to say that I won't raise my price at some point. I was really considering doing it this summer, but it's probably not the best time to do it. But, you know, down the road, I may raise it, but or I may go to something like, you know, like you guys are talking about, having like a 2-tier system where there's a more premium content and people can pay for that. Like those are all options, but for the most part, I do. It seems kind of stupid maybe on the outside, and I've had people tell me this before. Oh, you need to raise your price, but I don't think my business sense is like that bad right now. I think there are like legitimate reasons to not raise the price too much.
That kind of ties in pretty closely with another question I had on my list. So I started getting into your site back when Tony Bennett was our coach, and it really was in that that first season of his when they, you know, jumped up and all of a sudden we're a top 25 team and ended up in the tournament and all that. And there was sort of this disconnect between the idea that, you know, this team is really, really good. But, you know, they're, you know, for what we call now the counting stats, right? You know, the counting stats weren't very good. You know, this guy's, you know, they only average, you know, whatever, 60 points or 58 points or whatever it was as a team, but their defense is really, really great because they only allow, you know, 55 points or whatever it is. And so, you know, when I found what you were doing, I was like, it just like made so much sense. I'm like, well, yeah, of course, this is a way better way to measure most of this stuff. You know, and back then, you know, this is 12, 13 years ago, right? Like it was a really niche thing. Like there were not very many of us that were sort of, and I'm sure you can attest to that given what your subscriptions are now versus, you know, actually back then, I don't even think you had a subscription. Correct. So it's like, it was really niche back then. And then fast forward to today, and, you know, you can tune into an ESPN broadcast and hear people talk about things that they found on your page. Now they may not always do it correctly. and they may, as you mentioned, right. And they may not always say where they got it from, which is sort of annoying to me. I kind of wonder if that's annoying to you. But are you, at what point did you feel like, you know, this was really taking hold? And then did you ever reach a point where you were sort of surprised that you became this guru? And I'm guessing that was not what you were shooting for.
Correct. Yeah. When I started, it was really just you know, a labor of love for myself. Like I was building something that I wanted to use, and I thought there would be like an audience for it, and other people would want to use it. But I also knew that it, you know, wasn't something that would, you know, be used by mainstream media members, or however you want to phrase it, just because a lot of the information was so new, and you did have to kind of dig in and you know, read things and kind of figure out how to understand it. So that's the first point. The second part, you know, am I surprised? Like it's hard to answer that. Like I'm not surprised, but I don't mean to say that I'm like, I expected it. Like there's two different things. It's just that, it's been so incremental along the way that there's never been that point where it's like, whoa, I can't believe, I'm in this newspaper, or I can't believe that this guy on TV mentioned me. Like, at this point, it's not too surprising when somebody mentions me. And even, 10 years ago when I would, I guess Pete Thamel did the feature in the New York Times, like that was really cool and awesome. But I wasn't like too surprised that, somebody was interested in my work. So I'm not saying that I'm not, I'm not surprised because I'm like super arrogant about it. And like, oh yeah, I knew I'd be a success. Like I didn't even think about that. I guess that's the point, is I really never thought in those terms, but just the way things have evolved incrementally, there hasn't been like time to be surprised. Certainly 2005 me would have been surprised at the way things have evolved, but I am really bad at like having a 5-year, kind of long-term vision about anything. So I never even contemplated where things would be in 15 years without I'd even be still doing it,
And you get annoyed when they reference a stat from your page and then don't reference you? Because I get annoyed on your behalf.
Right. I appreciate that. And I guess I should point out, I don't expect people to reference me every time they use a stat. Like there's no need to do that. But I do think the first time you reference it, like if that's where you're getting the information, like it's just good form to say where you're getting it from. The one thing that annoyed me all season living here in Salt Lake City, the Pac-12 network is really egregious about this.
Yes, they are.
And all
as we know,
all season, like there's definitely some stats on my site you can get elsewhere. So there's, I'm never totally sure where people are getting it from, but they kept, I'd watch Utah games and they would keep referring to the fact that they were like the third youngest team in college basketball. And I don't know where else you're getting that information, but on my site, they're listed as the third youngest team in college basketball. And like just once, like it's not even necessarily like good form, but it's also like I could have an error in my calculation. So you might want to just take some cover here and just like mention where you got it from. Cause I could be totally wrong. Like I'd have maybe they're like really the 8th youngest team, right? And I have an error. That actually happened a couple of years ago. I had a glitch in the way I was calculating bench minutes, where if the 5th and 6th most players were tied in minutes, it like counted the 6th player and the 5th player as a starter. And so like early in the season, Kansas was listed as having like, 300, they were like 352nd in bench minutes or something. And Jesse Newell of the Kansas City Star like referred to it in a column, and all the fans were like, "What are you talking about? Like we play our bench a lot." And Jesse asked me about it, and I was like, "Oh crap, yeah." And so that's the main reason, I think. Like it's obviously good form to credit people, but it's also just like you might as well list a source because you don't know that this information is going to be stone cold accurate every time.
Well, I'm texting Kyle Smith right now, and we are taking up the Pac-12 network crusade. Don't worry.
Great.
It's funny. To that point, like Jeff talks about being mad when he hears that because I know you got that from Ken Pom, but like we've been following the site for so long that I remember when there was that article when Butler, and I joked about it in the intro, when Butler went to the Final Four, when Brad Stevens says, yeah, after every game I go and I sit down, I open my laptop to kenpom.com, and I remember that being kind of one of the first like mainstream, whatever you want to call it, articles, like because before that, like it felt like this battle, and we even have this other site in our kind of little WSU sphere that for years just battled us, and like other sites would mock us for using these nerd stats or whatever, and so you kind of built this like following of hardcores. Do you feel that like that because we became like sort of these like champions of tempo free stats because of your website, and then obviously Jeff and I got involved enough to write for College Basketball Prospectus and ESPN and stuff, but there was still like we were building those people on our site, and like there's all these people that just all of a sudden when you have Brad Stevens mentioning it, was that something where you already kind of past that point where it did, like, yeah, I know coaches are looking at my stuff, or was that still at that point felt kind of cool that it was mentioned that a Final Four coach mentioned that he was looking at your website? And I think it was still free at that point.
Yeah, I think that was the last year it was free. That was not an accident.
Pretty good advertising.
Right. Yeah, that was great. I mean, so it's great that there's a Final Four coach that's mentioning it. It's also great that, he was Brad Stevens, who was obviously doing things at Butler that, at the time and certainly in retrospect seem unfathomable. So,
yeah, absolutely.
And then obviously him, moving on. But I mean, no question. I mean, when people say, was there a turning point where things really got big for you? And there really isn't. But if there's one time you can point to, it's certainly that piece was of any single piece of media that I was involved in. That was the biggest one.
Well, yeah, it was fun for us. What about you, John? From a coach's perspective, you're younger than me, but when did you kind of latch on to these numbers?
Yeah, so my career kind of started as a manager at Columbia under Coach Smith. And pretty quickly, I would say that freshman year, I found out about the site and didn't totally understand it at first. And that's when I bought Basketball on Paper from Dean Oliver and kind of poured through that and tried to get my hands on any information I could. And I think I've read every single Ken Pomeroy blog post, even going back years before I was looking at it, and just trying to get familiar with it. And as we got more familiar with it as a staff, we started incorporating it more and more into our program in terms of goals that we create for the team every year, in terms of player development plans on, raising 2-point percentage, raising efficiency, some guys lowering usage or raising usage. In terms of team goals for the next year, like maybe a goal might be we want to be a top 30 defensive rebounding team, or we want to be in the top 50 of not turning it over, things like that. So as we've gotten more and more familiar with this site, it's become a bigger and bigger part of our program.
And Ken, how have you, do you have more and more coaches reach out to you?
I do. It seems also like the last couple of weeks I've had more coaches reach out than ever, really, because
they got nothing else
to do. Exactly.
They're like, give me something I can use. Give me something I can work with.
Right. Yeah. When people ask me about, how many teams subscribe or whatever, I don't track it, but my gut is that pretty much, every team is subscribing by now. I feel like every team subscribes just about. There may be a handful that don't, but every team subscribes. Probably about 150 use it on a regular basis, and then maybe 50 really know what they're doing. There's of that 150, there's probably 2/3 are using it because other people use it, but they're maybe not using it as critically or as properly as they should be. So.
I think what Coug fans would want to hear is, do you think WSU is one of those 50 or one of those 150?
No comment. No, no. I'm sure they're in the 50. They're probably in the top 10. The way it sounds.
Yeah. So Ken, we've gone through. We've been firing questions at you like crazy. Are there questions maybe that you or a question or multiple questions that you things that are on your brain since you have an assistant coach here sitting with you and things that maybe you're curious about? Because I know that whenever I hear you do a podcast with another coach, that's always one of the more interesting parts to me because you always have these things in your head that you love picking a coach's brain.
Yeah, kind of put me on the spot there. So
yeah, sorry, that's my bad.
I probably have after we're done, I'll have about 50 questions that I would have liked to have asked, but I know I can always contact John and get him to comment at least off the record. But yeah, it would be nice to get some comments on the record. But yeah, what's one of the blog posts that you hated the most, John?
Oh, wow, you just flipped it around. You put me on the spot here. Well, let me say this, and I may be guilty of a Jim Boeheim here and misattributing a stat column to you, but I believe you at one point made a remark about matchups and how, basically if you're just going off the Ken Pom ranks and adjusting for home and away, that sort of thing, you're a little bit skeptical of there being stuff beyond that that makes a big difference in terms of win probability. Is that a fair attribution?
That is a fair attribution. Yeah, I mean, I would love to disprove that idea, I guess, mathematically, but I take it you're going to help me do that here.
Well, I don't know about disproving it, but I am a proponent of matchups in terms of I just think there are some teams, and it may not be as simple as the 4 factors, where maybe how you guard a ball screen fits very well or very poorly with how they attack ball screens or run them or don't run them. And I think that can shift the percentage slightly. So I guess my theory would be you could have 2 teams that are, let's say, exactly the same. They're number 100 Ken Pom, but the way they play is totally different. And for your team, maybe you got a 52% chance of beating Team A and a 39% chance of beating Team B, just because of how you play or how you guard things, or their proclivity for getting certain positions in foul trouble, things like that. So I don't want to give any bulletin board material to anybody in our league, so I guess I'll stay out of our league. But when I was at Dartmouth last year, we just felt we matched up really well with Harvard. We guarded ball screens with ice on each side of the floor. They always played 2 non-shooter bigs. And so for the fact that they were a decent offensive team, we felt like we could guard them. And then on the other side of the ball, we just thought the way they guarded things, we could get some assisted baskets and specifically open threes. So I think we were 29% on your site to win the first game at home, and then 20% to win the second game on the road. And we ended up winning the first game by 15 points, and we lost the second one close. We had a free throw to tie with 30 seconds left. But if you played that out for 100 games, I really think we could have won 40 of them instead of the 25% or so that the math would suggest. I'm probably wrong. I'm probably using a small sample size here, but that's my feel anecdotally from coaching over the last few years.
Right. I don't discount what you're saying. I think where I tend to cringe. So I mean, I appreciate that perspective. Where I get more defensive is, I guess, more maybe not necessarily talking to coaches, but just hearing. It seems to be like a buzzword among media members to make somebody sound smart. Where it's like, well, this team could win it all, but it's all about matchups. And I really don't like the matchup against this team, and they don't really necessarily explain like why it's a bad matchup. But so that always leaves me a little skeptical. But I guess the thing I think about in more of a general sense is teams that tend to dominate lesser. They're in a lesser conference and they dominate their opposition in a way from the scoring margin that makes you think they could hang with like really good teams in Power 5 leagues, and then they end up getting that opportunity, and like the athletic disparity comes into play in a way that you don't necessarily see when they're playing other competition, and so they're maybe not as good against elite teams as you would expect. Kind of, really similar to what you were talking about earlier with the transfers, guys transferring up, and there's clearly, I think you guys didn't talk about it, but to me there's like kind of an athletic barrier that you have to meet to successfully transfer up and still be a contributing player. And I think it's similar on a team level as well. Like, I don't know, to have a great example. I guess the example that comes to mind is, when Gonzaga met North Carolina in the national championship game, 4 years ago. You could see there was clearly an athletic advantage. Like, Gonzaga was probably the more skilled team, but North Carolina wasn't far behind, and they had a certain athletic advantage, which allowed them to be the superior team. If you looked at more scoring margin related stats, Gonzaga should have been the favorite, but in watching the game, it seemed like legitimately like North Carolina was a better team. Maybe not by much, but they were.
Yeah, I piggybacking on that, I agree totally, and I think one thing that we would say too, because we've now coached at pretty much every level of Division I basketball, and we always felt that there was a cumulative effect of playing against these bigger, stronger, more athletic teams, where you could become much more prone to get injured, get worn down. And so, like, when we were at Columbia, we had a really nice team our last year that won 25 games, and we played a couple high majors and stuck with them, had a chance to win, and we did feel like for one game, yeah, we think we could beat almost anybody. Now, would we be favored? No, but we had a shot. But if you put us in one of those leagues where we had to play 18 of those in a row or 20 of those in a row, just how skinny we were and small we would have gotten worn down, is what we always felt, and just gotten injured too. And I think that's been a transition for us too, coming to Washington State, is that we really do feel like you need to have some big, strong, athletic bodies, specifically in the front court, because if you don't, by the time you get to game 10, game 12, you're going to have guys in the training room a little bit too often, and guys, playing on injuries that are undisclosed that are holding them back, and then some guys that are just not even cleared.
Yeah, it's interesting. It makes a lot of sense.
One thing I was thinking about when you were talking about Gonzaga against North Carolina, and I can't remember who was favored in that team on your site, or on that game in your site, but I think it was pretty close to 50-50. Is one thing that Jeff and I joke about quite often on this is the kind of the general public's misunderstanding of probability, and how much do you run into that, and do you think, coming to your website, there's sort of a baseline understanding of probability that someone might need to actually be able to use it effectively?
Yes, it's a frustrating thing every year, and I don't know how to present it better, I guess, on my site. But obviously, when you go, the issue I run into, and you guys are probably aware of, you go to a team page, and a team will be, an underdog in the next 12 games or whatever, and some writer will invariably say, like, Ken Palm projects them to go 0-12 and lose their next 12 games. I'm like, no. That's not what I'm saying. They will be an underdog in those games, but underdogs do win games, and there's a probability right there, and you can see it. But
I was just about to ask how upset you were that we didn't go 0-18 this year.
Yeah, and So I mean, yeah, right. You're the, if you're the lowest ranked team in the league, like, you're just not going to be favored in many games. You might be favored in 0 games at the beginning of the season, and obviously I'm not predicting you to lose all those games. So, there's it's frustrating, but I also feel like there's got to be a better way to present that information, but I don't know how to do it. I've thought about, like, I can't remove like the L and W from the prediction because there's a score there. I could remove the score and the L and W, I guess, and just put a probability. That would really kind of drive it home, maybe.
Yeah, please don't remove that.
Yeah, I mean,
interesting.
I agree. Like, I do want to see that projected score. So I don't know if you guys have ideas. I'm all ears, but that is definitely the next frontier, I think, for the public.
Improved mathematical education in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, outside of that, so people who listen to the podcast know this, Ken, but I'm actually a high school teacher. I'm an English teacher, but I'm a high school teacher, and I'm always like, we should be teaching stats. That's it. Like, once you get past like geometry, it should be that's it, stats. But I kind of wonder how many like angry tweets you get, or how many like. So, for example, the Gonzaga game. Gonzaga was actually a 60, almost a little over 60% favorite in that game, according to your model, and of course they end up losing the game. So it's sort of like I wonder how many tweets you get where you're like, your system's crap because this team only had a 10% chance of winning and they won.
Right. I get that all the time. I mean, I think there's definitely a subset of fans that understand the real value there is that, you know, it those probabilities can help you assess how shocking an upset is, or in some cases how not shocking it is, and that there's definitely some value in that. That really is the purpose of it. You know, when Evansville beats Kentucky, like, hey, that's a 1% win, and you know, there's only been, you know, an average of like 2 or 3 of those a year, in the past 10 years. So that kind of puts that into perspective in a way that maybe just looking at the point spread doesn't.
Right, because 1% of the games is right, like,
yes.
You know, that should be the outcome 1% of the time.
Yeah, you should have those. If your system is well calibrated, that should happen. 1% wins should happen every now and then. And I actually added this on the site this year in the middle of the season to the very conspicuously or inconspicuously the bottom of the fan match page, where there's a link to like the model diagnostics, which shows a breakdown of like how all the win probability forecasts are done by range. And so there were 76 games this year that had a prediction of 99% or higher, and the favorite went 75-1, which is, you know, roughly what you'd expect. And there were 104 games where the probability was 98 to 99%, and the favorite went 104, which is actually a little bit underperforming this year. But so it does, you know, there is some information there that at least I can look at to make sure that the predictions are doing well. But yeah, I mean, that's the whole point, is that there is a chance of the underdog winning all these games, and if your predictions are well calibrated, you know, the 90% favorite should only win 9 out of 10 games, so there will be some losses in there.
And I know from my end, it makes a difference how you write about it too. Like, I notice a difference if I say, for example, that, you know, WSU has a 40% chance of winning the game, versus saying like, you know, WSU would be, you know, predicted to win the game 40% of the time. Like, that's it, you know, it's the same thing, but it's like, it just frames a little differently in the brain, you know, where it's like, oh, okay, so 4 out of 10 times, you know, the team would be expected to win. Oh, that's not crazy. You know, it's like, so I don't know. I try to frame it as I do with all the stats. Like, that's kind of the one thing I've learned in the, you know, last dozen years writing about this stuff, is that, you know, how you frame it and how you say it really makes a big difference in terms of how the reader understands it. And then John, I know you got, you know, one more thing here to chime in on these game predictions.
Yeah. So, you know, for every game of the season, Ken puts on his site who's projected to win and by what margin. And he also puts a percentage, you know, so Washington State is 34% to win this road game. They're 62% to win this game, and so on and so forth. And what's kind of funny is my head coach, Kyle Smith, really tries to avoid seeing those lines before games. And I think there's some real value in that, as far as like, we don't want the line to soften us up. You know, we don't want to ever feel like, hey, we're only 12% to win this road game. It's, you know, quote unquote, okay to lose, you know, because if you're constantly celebrating moral victories, you're not really celebrating many real victories, you know? So like, at a certain point, you got to turn the program around, and turning programs involves sort of outkicking your coverage and doing better than what the models and predictions say, you know, winning that 16% game, winning 2 more games that year than you were supposed to win in the preseason.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate that. So there's, you know, obviously the famous scene where Han Solo is steering the Millennium Falcon into the asteroid minefield or whatever. I don't know. You know the scene I'm talking about, though. Han Solo is like asking C-3PO, you know, what are the odds of this being successful? Or I forget how it works. C-3PO is telling him like what the odds are, and Han Solo's like, you know, forget the odds. Like, which if you're in that situation and trying to win a game, like, yeah, I don't think the odds are necessarily useful, like you say, but I do think sometimes there might be some benefit in knowing that, you know, you're like, especially, you know, I think people are always surprised when you're playing a good team and you're playing at home, like your chances of winning, even the worst team in the conference against the best team in the conference, are more than people tend to think. You know, home court advantages, even though I talk about how it's decreasing over time, it's still very real. And I think sometimes there's a little, you know, I'll go to a game where a team feels like, they should be an obvious underdog, and you look and they're like, they're actually not that much of an underdog. And sometimes I wonder how you can use that to your advantage, because the perception might be that you're a huge underdog, or you can flip it. The perception might be that you're a huge favorite. And if you look at the line and you find out, well, you're only a 60% favorite, then you're probably going to not take that opponent lightly. And maybe that will help you prepare better. I don't know. But
so just to kind of follow up on that, have you, and John, you can chime in on this as well. So I'm kind of curious, maybe from both of your perspectives, is there a recipe for an upset? So in other words, like, when a team pulls off a big upset, is there something strategically that they're doing? Are there any common threads? I mean, maybe other than just unusually hot shooting or something like that, right? But, is there anything like strategic, for example, shooting a ton of threes, right? Some sort of high variance, strategy. Have you ever noticed anything like that? And then maybe John, you can chime in as well as a coaching staff. 'Cause like, Ken, you were saying maybe there's some value in kind of knowing, what you're up against. And maybe that can influence coaching strategy as well. And John, I know you had a situation at a previous stop, I think you said at Columbia, where you kind of went with a high variance strategy down the stretch to pull out a game. So I guess, Ken, I'll throw that to you first if you've noticed anything, and then John, you can jump in on that.
So this was the concept I first read about in basketball on paper. Dean Oliver, talked about using high variance strategies when you're an underdog, and it made a lot of sense. Like if basketball was played on paper, it would make even more sense. But over time, I've kind of felt like, so you think about those high variance strategies, like, one of them was like pressing, one of them was playing a low possession game, shooting a lot of threes. I mean, those are the obvious ones. But for the most part, it feels like, unless that's your team identity, like going out of your way to play a low possession game or going out of your way to press, like if you don't do those things, like you're going to make your team worse in general. So despite the fact that you're adding variance, it's not really improving your chance of an upset. Now, obviously last 3, 4, 5 minutes or whatever, different story. Obviously there are times where you're going to have to press when you get behind, or you should take more threes or whatever. But generally I feel like the high variance concept is, my feeling is anyway, I'm curious to hear what John thinks, but I think it's a little bit overstated.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, the one we always struggled with was the possession count. And, like we played Kentucky at Columbia one year, and we really did go out of our way to keep the possessions low, and they were low, and we stayed in the game for a long time, but we did ultimately lose, so I don't know if that really, that increased our chance of winning, or it just made the margin a little bit closer. The other one, the one that I like though, is when you're down late in games, let's say like down 9 with 4 minutes left or something, just trying to put out the very best offensive team on the floor that you can. And I guess the logic behind it is, if we're down 9 with 4 minutes left, the most basic thing that we have to do in order to have a chance to win is we got to score 9 points. So you're probably only going to have 4, 5, 6 possessions left, and you need to be able to score on almost all those possessions or every single one. So I do think, maybe playing small in those type of situations could give you a little better chance of coming back. And that actually, unfortunately, that happened to us. When we were at Columbia, Princeton beat us by doing that. We were kind of in the driver's seat in the game at home, and they just put 5 guards on the floor down the stretch, and you're scared to throw it inside. You're scared to attack too much because you want to burn clock. You don't want to have a quick possession, and you definitely don't want to commit an offensive foul. But so I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
The incredible shrinking lineups effect, basically. But yeah, I agree. Like obviously, when you're down, it makes more sense you need points. It makes more sense to put the small lineup out there, and usually the other team has to adjust and go small to defend the greater offensive versatility. The other thing that I like that came to mind was, I've written about this before. It's a little wacky, but the Ty Lawson move, where I'm surprised more teams don't do this when they're big underdogs. but after a made basket, if you're the underdog and you have a lead in the second half, you can milk the clock by inbounding the ball and have basically nobody touch it for a while. So the start of the shot clock is delayed. And UMBC did that a few times against Virginia. That's really the only time I've seen a team kind of do that in a very obvious way. But it seems like a way to bleed a significant amount of the clock. And the irony is that actually Virginia kind of plays that way themselves, just as a normal way. Like after a made basket, Virginia is often very lazy in terms of inbounding the basketball, especially when they have a lead. So to have it done against them in such an exaggerated way was kind of funny. But I'm curious, I'm hopeful to see more 16 seeds try that strategy in the future.
Yeah, well, it helps when they UMBC also made every single three they took. Like
there was a lot more going on there. They obviously didn't win the game just because they broke Ty Lawson.
But yeah, it's kind of the reverse strategy of when your team is down late in the game, you're trying to save clock on a stopped clock.
Right.
And instead, the other way around is to you like you say, you can. The clock's running after the basket. You take 4 seconds to inbound. You roll it up the court. Take 5 seconds to grab the ball. The shot clock doesn't start, and suddenly that's 40 seconds. You can bleed off the clock, and that's a fun thing. You ever considered that, John? Have you ever considered that strategy?
Yeah, for sure. I think the balance we're trying to strike is not is staying positive with the team and making them feel like, hey, we can win this game. If you bring out too many quirks and stuff like that, the players can get a sense from their coaches that, oh, they don't think we can win this game. They think we're up against Goliath and this is going to be hard. So that's the balance we're trying to strike. But for sure, I think that strategy should be going on a lot more.
Well, and some of this is communicating strategy to players too, right? Because like I know, Ken did a pretty extensive look at, fouling up three, right? And okay, so everybody, fouling up three makes total sense. And I know the result of your analysis, Ken, was, it's a lot more of a toss up than you probably think. If I remember right, part of your analysis was, okay, you're assuming, perfect execution from players, and that's far from a certainty.
Correct. Yes. That. I guess I'm curious to hear John's thoughts on it, but certainly that is that. When people kind of dispute my findings, that's the thing that they bring back is like, well, hey, you really have to practice it, and if you practice it, then your players won't make mistakes. And players are going to make mistakes. I agree. Like, if you do need to practice it, but players are still going to make mistakes. Officials are going to make mistakes. That's the other thing that happens, although it seems to be happening less often these days. Like, there were some pretty, I don't have any like specific examples to give you, but on more than one occasion this year, I saw guys who clearly were anticipating getting fouled in that situation go into the shooting motion, from like half court and get fouled, and the official wouldn't give them 3 shots on the, on that kind of move. When like 10 years ago when I was doing the study, or whenever it was, 7 years ago, like that seemed to happen, 2 or 3 times a year. So anyway, I guess I don't know if John wants to reveal state secrets, but like, where do you stand on the fouling up 3 thing?
Yeah. So we've generally taken one strategy or the other, just to keep it simple with the team. Like, we are going to be a foul up 3 team or we're not. Now, in reality, we feel that there are matchup things that can affect which way to go is better. And, for instance, like we always talked about back when we were playing Yale at Columbia, and they had Brandon Sherrod and Justin Sears. They were one of the very best offensive rebounding teams in the country, and they kind of famously out-rebounded Baylor in the tournament. And we felt that was a team that we were not going to foul up 3 because it was going to be very, very hard to get that rebound, especially in a gotta have it sort of situation for them where, let's be honest, the refs are going to let more go in terms of pushing in the back, pushing under, over the back, things like that.
Yeah. So that was one of my findings too, was that what offensive rebounding rate was like 40% on on that missed free throw. And I don't know if you read my piece regarding the free throw violation strategy at the Athletic earlier this year, which Bob Walsh talked about. We don't need to get into that, but in reviewing some of the clips from his team, there was this case where there was just this absolute mugging for an offensive rebound where like one of his players like basically got tackled or just shoved in the back, like going for an offensive rebound. There's no call. And, you're absolutely right. Like that stuff largely gets let go in that situation.
So, Ken, you have been amazingly gracious and generous with your time. We've gone well past 90 minutes. But I do want to give John one more chance to ask anything that's sort of on his brain that he wanted to make sure that he got in terms of picking your brain here.
All right. So, Ken, what if you became a Division I head coach tomorrow? Is there anything that you think you would do differently than normal coaching staff does, or things that you would value more that would help you win more games?
Oh, man. I hate this question, John, because first of all, if I was a Division I head coach, I would really suck.
Subscription canceled then. I don't know.
Yeah.
We're all good at some things and not others, right? But how would you, philosophically, right? I think that's sort of what the question's getting after is, philosophically, what sorts of things would you emphasize and try and build to be the most successful?
Well, here's the thing, okay? What's the most important thing for a basketball team? And it's the players. Like, you have to have players. And so I would really, like, to me, the data-driven approach to recruiting and acquiring players, whether it's, recruiting high school players or transfers or international guys or whatever, is, really in its infancy. Like there are obviously efforts out there and people are trying to do things, but it's, I don't know, there might be like 10 programs that actually know what they're doing in that regard. And I think there's a huge advantage to be gained there, especially if you're not, the top team in your league. If you're at some sort of kind of structural or financial disadvantage or whatever, like that's how you can get ahead. And so if I was working for a program or whatever, that would be my suggestion is just hire somebody whose sole focus is to work on that. Because it's a difficult problem, not easy to solve, but is solvable. And there's more data out there than there's ever been. So that's one of the reasons it's solvable. So that, if you get the players, your head coach can use any array of poor strategies and still be successful. So that's where I would go.
I like that a lot. I think that's a great answer.
Well, I do. I will have to give John some kudos here. WSU just landed one of their best big man recruits of all time this last week. So whatever analytics you're using, John, good job. I guess, we can wrap it up here. Ken, if you have anything that you'd want to point people to or anything you want to promote while you're here, feel free.
Nothing. Things are kind of slow right now, guys. So I don't necessarily have anything going on that I can point to at the moment. Obviously,
well, I'll just tell people, the subscription's good for a year. So if they buy it now, it'll carry them through all of next season. Just get in ahead of the game, and
Yeah, there's still some stuff I got to work out, I guess, from last year in terms of people, expecting to pay for a tournament that they didn't get. But the subscription is good for 12 months, and if for some reason the tournament gets delayed or whatever next year, I'll take care of you. But yeah, got KenPom.com, and hopefully I'll crank out some articles. You alluded to something Jeff Goodman has been talking about that I might have to write about just because.
Yes.
It's
blood feud.
Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah.
So hopefully there'll be some writing up on the blog here in the next few weeks.
I mean, what else are you going to do?
Yeah.
More podcast interviews?
Well, that's I don't mind doing that at all, that's for sure.
Well, we're here every week, Ken. So.
All right.
We haven't talked about yet how WSU is the national champion,
right?
Because it won the
final game. I was going to bring that up myself. Yeah, I remember watching that last game, like, just thinking about, I don't know how it was like within the team, but from the outside, I was just like, because normally I go to the Pac-12 tournament, and I did not go because I saw what was coming, and just watching that game was kind of bizarre because I can't remember. I think Walton was calling it, maybe like Ted Robinson.
Yeah, Walton was calling it.
Yeah, and it was just like the contrast between that game and the NBA game that was going on against it, between I forget who it was, the Mavericks were playing, and like Doris Burke was one of the analysts, and whoever the play-by-play guy was, like they were aware that, hey, this is probably the last game we're going to call for a while, and Ted Robinson and Bill Walton were just like blissfully like unaware, like just treating this game like it was the most important thing in the world. And
well, in fairness, Bill Walton does that with everything, so just
I know,
blissfully
but it was a very unusual approach in that situation.
I did go to your fan match page when you mentioned it earlier, and CJ Ellaby did have the line of the night that night. So not only WSU national champion, CJ Ellaby most outstanding player
of the year,
player of the year. But don't tell him any of that, John. He has to come back. He has a lot more to accomplish, right? So.
No doubt. We got to keep our crown as highest preseason rated Ken Pom team.
That's right.
It's a low bar, John. I should point that out. I don't want to rain on your
Damn.
But that has nothing to do with
podcast. He's done.
But John, that has nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
So
yeah. That's more of a commentary on other staffs. So.
All right. Well, thank you both. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, John. This was a lot of fun for us. I hope it was a lot of fun for y'all listening. Yeah, go ahead and please check out kenpom.com and give them your $20 if you want. I know I do, and I love it. Ken, again, I just wanted to say you have been a tremendous influence on me as a human being and as a writer. I appreciate you chatting with us today. And yeah, so Jeff, I don't know if you have anything else you want to say, but except maybe go Cougs.
Go Cougs.
Go Cougs.